Thank you. Quite clearly a no. Now, Arun Menawat, you're on the other side. Yes. Sure, yes, stand there. And there'll be a chance for a rebuttal.
So there are two rules. One is I'm already winning, so the rule of thumb is if you're winning, you should just shut up and go home. So the second rule is anyone who votes for me have free drinks after this session. So hopefully that'll work too. So, but let me talk about this a little bit seriously. I think that I would like to kind of take off from a little bit from Dr. Aiton's presentation earlier today and from Dr. Irish as well. When we think about what's going on in healthcare, I do think that the world GDP and the global growth rate of healthcare matters the most. And the rules of the game are going to change. Today it's value-based, tomorrow it's going to be elderly care, and third day it's going to be chronic diseases and all of the above, and so on. But as entrepreneurs, I think the way I look at it is the world economy, whenever the world economy gets to, if you look at the last 20 years or so, if it gets to 3.75 or 3.8% in that range, you kind of start to see healthcare doing very well. And we're probably not quite, I think in the last couple of years, we're not quite there. We're probably around 3.6 maybe or so. But I think that if you look at the aging population around the world and the growth rates that most companies are projecting, I think you will start to see that the growth is coming and healthcare will be an area where it will be invested into. And so I kind of look at it from that high level perspective first. The second point is that when we look at benchmarks, if you look at the largest companies in medical devices, Medtronic, or prior to that when Covidien was an independent company, or even Stryker and some of these big players, what you will find is that more than 50% of their revenues are in fact now coming from outside of the United States. So just because they're based in the United States, that does not mean they cannot do business outside of the United States. And so if we think about these two things, the global world and the fact that there are benchmarks that show that we don't need to necessarily be there to have revenues from the rest of the world, I think that you would lead to the conclusion that we need to just think about the new games or new rules of the games and how do we play while we are in Canada. So I kind of choose to think about it from that perspective. And I think Dr. Irish's example was fantastic because while at the high level, we've been talking about value-based healthcare for 20 years. I've heard this term when we were doing with Novak, and Lukash would remember this, when we were really 10 people, and we first went to GE to talk about what could we do together. They said, well, we don't want to talk about anything but value-based because value-based is coming. But and this is not a criticism of anybody, but the fact is that the chief financial officer of the hospital today doesn't know anything about the value-based healthcare system. What he knows is what is cost and what is revenue. He doesn't know how to connect them. He doesn't know how to optimize them. And the reality is that the innovation, in fact, I think part of the innovation that we need in healthcare really needs to be in the financial system at the hospital level, because it's until that person gets the change and understands how to optimize, it isn't going to happen. And I think to your point earlier, until we recognize that good quality means lower cost, it's going to be talk. That's really what I think it is about. So let me move to the day-to-day level a little bit. And so assuming that if we talk about Canada as a given, so you say to yourself, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm going to stay in Canada, I'm going to build it, and I do have the honor of having done that twice in Canada before, and hopefully I'm really honored to be part of Profound, and hopefully we'll do it again. And so at the early stage, companies have very little capital. And most of you are in that, many of you are here, are entrepreneurs, and money is one of the biggest, the most valued commodity in the beginning, as much as science and technology is important. Without the money, you cannot go anywhere. And if you're in Canada, you can use the research and development funds, and you can apply for grants. And you can literally do quite a bit of research. You can do a lot of clinical work. And it does speak to your point, at the early stage. And so at Novavac, as I said, Lukesh, and we were all part of this team, we helped get a $2 million grant that did our first clinical work. And we did approximately 1,000 patients. And it allowed us to actually understand what our product was all about, what the value was. And so when we started to fund research or do clinical work in other parts of the world, such as the United States or China or Japan, we actually knew exactly what we were doing. And the cost of doing that to us was much less, and the research dollars certainly helped tremendously. So I could make the argument easily that if you are in a country like Canada, that your cost structure by design is much less, and thereby you actually want to be in Canada in that earlier stage, if value-based becomes more and more important. The other argument, I think it's pretty clear, is that the United States is the largest market for medical, and I agree that it's not the most efficient market, but it's the largest market. So I think that the most kin to the US is Canada. And so I kind of think that that's actually an even bigger positive, that you're in a lower cost country and you're a neighbor to the country, so you can easily get the analysis and so on with them. So, I think when we were building Novavac, for example, we did the early research here. We were able to use a lot of that data even for reimbursement in US because there's only one country's data that they will accept, which is Canada, outside of US. And we were able to design much better clinical trials when we went to US because of the initial information we had. We were also able to connect to opinion-leading surgeons there because we had opinion-leading surgeons in Canada on our side. So I think that we were able to sort of have our cake and eat it too in that sense, and that's what I would encourage everyone to look at. We built a big sales team in US. We had something in the order of over 200 people who were in sales. We were direct. We spent a lot of money. Simultaneous to that, and I do agree with Lihav in the sense that it is a little bit a bigger challenge, but when we were able to convince the medical community that we had something to offer, the Wall Street embraced us nicely. And they were able to forgive the fact that we were actually based in Canada, and they funded the company nicely. And we were listed on NASDAQ, and they treated us just like they would treat a US type company. So, our cost structure ultimately was in US, and just like, we would go to China, there will be people we will hire in China. There will be people in Japan we would hire. So I guess that's kind of the crux of my message, is that I think that we're first and foremost entrepreneurs, and we have to look at our hand and say, what are the advantages? And I think that there are some of these advantages that I've listed, and just because the world is global, the world is changing to value-based does not necessarily mean that we have a disadvantage. I think you can turn it into an advantage to yourself. Thank you.